of this. The Regulatory Powers Act provides for a standard suite of provisions in relation to monitoring and investigation powers, as well as enforcement provisions through the use of civil penalties, infringement notices, enforceable undertakings and injunctions. These provisions are designed to simplify and streamline regulatory powers across the Commonwealth Statute Book and represent best practice legislation. The Regulatory Powers Act commenced on the 1st of October 2014. The Regulatory Powers Act only has effect where Commonwealth Acts are drafted or amended to trigger its provisions. This standardisation project is the second of its kind following the Regulatory Powers Standardisation Reform Act of 2017, which amended 15 Commonwealth Acts to repeal existing provisions providing for regulatory regimes in those acts and instead trigger the standard provisions of the Regulatory Powers Act. It's all very fascinating, Mr Deputy Speaker. The bill amends the following Commonwealth Acts to trigger the standard provisions: the Defence Force Discipline Act, the Education Services for Overseas Students Act, the Fisheries Management Act, the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Act, the Tobacco Advertising Prohibition Act and the Tobacco Plain Packaging Act. Now, some of these acts contain existing regulatory regimes which this bill replaces with the standard provisions to align the Act's regulatory regimes with the standard provisions. I note the member for Berowra has also come into the chamber because he also wants a piece of the action to talk on this extremely important piece of legislation. The bill provides additional powers for current regulatory regimes in some acts to ensure they are robust and align with best practice. The bill also provides some regulatory powers to acts which do not currently contain regulatory regimes but require regulatory powers to ensure a robust compliance and enforcement scheme. Modifications to the standard powers are included where necessary for effective regulation in the context of each Act. The bill also makes minor amendments to the Regulatory Powers Act to ensure that the regulatory requirements and underlying penalty and offence provisions of acts that trigger the Regulatory Powers Act can be effectively enforced. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the specific acts that this Act will impact upon. The first one, I'll come back to the Defence Force Discipline Act in a moment. The Fisheries Management Act is a very, very important piece of legislation, and it's very important for my constituents and my commercial fishers in the good seat of Fisher. It's not a particularly well-known fact, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the good seat of Fisher on the glorious Sunshine Coast is home to the largest commercial fishing fleet on the eastern seaboard of Australia for tuna and prawns. We have some absolutely fantastic local businesses like Walker Seafoods that operate out of Mooloolaba. And at the end of the day, what this government is all about is deregulation, making life simpler for small businesses. And I get very excited, Mr Deputy Speaker, when I can point to legislation. A member for Berowra is going to throw me off track here, but when I can point to legislation which makes life easier and the legislative burden less upon businesses in my electorate, and this Act will do just that. The commercial fishers in the seat of Fisher, operating out of the Mooloolaba Harbour, are all extremely hard-working men and women, and they employ hundreds of locals. And it's a tough gig to be a commercial fisher person. I've spent a lot of time working with people at the wharf. I won't be too much longer here, but the good people of Fisher working as fishers out of Mooloolaba will be direct benefits of this revolutionary piece of legislation. Now, I do want to, you know, we often talk about how this place can be, you know, very hostile, and how it you know, the politics of the day. I want to do a bit of a shout out to those opposite. So I'm hoping that the minister or the shadow minister at the table will look at me, because I'm going to say something nice. Because the Tobacco Advertising Prohibition Act and the Tobacco Plain Packaging Act, particularly the Tobacco Plain Packaging Act, was an act of Nicola Roxon, I think it was at that time, and that was a world-leading piece of legislation, which, as we all know, removed the branding from cigarette packets. I think that was a world first. I think that it has made a fairly significant impact, particularly on young people's smoking rates. And of course, we all know that for many years, from both sides of politics, we don't allow cigarette advertising on television and on newspapers. And going off on a tangent for one moment, it's my fervent hope and desire and wish that we follow the same approach to gambling as we have with cigarettes. But that's for another day, Madam Deputy Speaker. The other act that I want to go to in relation to this bill is the Defence Force Discipline Act. Now, the good seat of Fisher and the Sunshine Coast, probably more particularly, is home to around about 15,000 veterans. If you're going to discharge from the ADF, there's no better place to discharge to than the glorious Sunshine Coast. And we have one of the largest veteran populations on the Sunshine Coast. The Defence Force Discipline Act is a very, very important piece of legislation which administers discipline to those members in the ADF. And speaking of the ADF, I was very saddened to see today that the Victorian State Government has cancelled Anzac Day marches. Now, it's okay for the Victorian State Government to have the Australian Open. It's okay for the Victorian Government to allow all sorts of demonstrations on the streets of Melbourne. But for some absolutely bizarre reason, the Victorian State Government has come out today and said that they will not allow marches on Anzac Day. Now, Member for Berowra, I'm wondering, you're perhaps a lot smarter than me, you might be able to, when you come up to the microphone, tell us why you think that might be. I don't understand why it would be.
Order. The member for
Fisher
is just reminded to return to the substance of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I am speaking on one of the acts that the bill is going to trigger the standard provisions of the Regulatory Powers Act, which is, of course, the Defence Force Discipline Act. But I accept that I may be straying just a little. Madam Deputy Speaker, the measures represents the second coordinated tranche, as I've said, of amendments to Commonwealth Acts to trigger the operation of the Regulatory Powers Act. Now, going back to the Schedule 2, I think it is. Schedule 2. Now, Schedule 2 provides that will make minor amendments to the Regulatory Powers Act to ensure that the regulatory requirements and underlying penalty and offence provisions of acts that trigger the Regulatory Powers Act can be effectively enforced. Those amendments would enable the use of monitoring powers in relation to matters rather than only in relation to a provision. I'm directly on point here, Madam Deputy Speaker. Or information given in compliance with a provision, and update the description of offence provisions and the description of provisions relating to infringement notices which might apply to contravention of both a civil penalty and criminal offence provision to ensure consistency throughout the Regulatory Powers Act and respond to recent drafting practices. Now, I'm sorry, that was Schedule 1. Schedule 2 is in relation to the Defence Force Discipline Act. The Defence Force Discipline Act creates a system for the enforcement and maintenance of good order and discipline in the Australian Defence Force. The Defence Force Discipline Act also serves to ensure the effectiveness, efficiency and morale of the ADF, and consequently the defence of the nation and public confidence. The DFDA does this through creating a discipline system which includes a disciplinary offence code, which is sometimes referred to as service offences. All ADF members are subject to the DFDA in certain situations. A specified category of civilian persons, defence civilians and prisoners of war are also subject to the DFDA. The DFDA currently establishes a framework that allows for the investigation of service offences under the DFDA. The framework includes extensive investigation powers that are appropriate and necessary within a military context. However, the exercise of many of these powers are confined to service land. This application limits the practical scope of the existing investigation powers. Further, many of the investigation powers themselves have not changed to take account of the evolving nature of military life and offending. Schedule 2, Madam Deputy Speaker, amends the DFDA to trigger the investigation provisions in Part 3 of the Regulatory Powers Act to enable investigation of alleged service offences on premises which are not service land. That is, civilian premises and public places, triggering Part 3 of the Regulatory Powers Act, provides a supplementary suite of investigation powers to those currently available under Part 6 of the DFDA that are more appropriate for application on service land, non-service land. The availability of investigation powers that can be used on civilian premises and public places is necessary as service offences and the evidence required to investigate those offences, such as bank statements, real estate records, CCTV footage and other things that may not be located on service land. The amendments in Schedule 2 are necessary in order to ensure that evidential material can be obtained wherever it is located, either with the consent of the occupier of the premises or the owner of the thing, or by executing a warrant. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm going to allow my learned friend to jump up shortly and speak to some of the other acts that this bill will impact upon. But I am very proud to stand here today in support of this bill because particularly, not just will it assist the proper and effective discipline of those serving in the ADF, it will also help people like my fisher people, fishermen and women operating in Fisher, out of fishing boats on the Sunshine Coast, because this government is all about reducing regulatory red tape, and this bill does exactly that. I commend the bill to the House.
The question is that the words proposed to be omitted stand part of the question.